Hi, welcome to Philly Coco's Side Project Spotlight, episode 5. Where are we? My name is Kotaro.
I'm Steve.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are a part of Philly Coco's meetup group. We're basically a user group that meets monthly, 2 times a month. And obviously we can't do that at this moment. So we are now working on building an app. Basically, we're trying to help kind of facilitate this idea that we have been a meetup of builders and we like to build stuff. So one of the things that we were interested in building was an exclusive watch app. And this is sort of our journey to figuring that out and figuring out the watchOS platform. And this is, you're kind of watching us in real time or listening to us in real time, explore that environment and as an app developer.
Yeah. I am coming into this with probably maybe the least amount of SwiftUI experience or Swift experience because mostly I'm working on Objective-C. So we last time had gotten through, I think, like our third or fourth sprint. It's hard to keep track.
This is episode 5, but technically this is our 4th sprint.
Yeah, but we're nearing the end of our self-imposed schedule to get the core mechanics of the app working because we just had Thanksgiving. We have the other holidays coming up. And we really want to get something out before Christmas was the idea. So first, we're going to start by just going over our sprint retrospective. Let's see where we are right now.
So my responsibility so what we're building for this season is a Kanji watch app, which is kind of like a way for you to test your knowledge of Japanese kanji characters, where you have a traditional like card that you sort of look at. You look at the kanji, you swipe left or right, or whether you got it wrong or right.
Yeah, I found out that I have absolutely no knowledge of kanji.
Just slightly below my knowledge in that sense. But basically, so my responsibility for this particular sprint is basically a time frame of 2 weeks, was to get the card mechanic of the swipe mechanic working for that. And when
it's like a swipe left, swipe right thing, yeah,
like Tinder, kind of like a Tinder mechanic for swipe left, swipe right. And I got it to work, actually. The challenge was making sure that the data set was correct, was the correct amount and the correct set of data, so that it would handle itself right. And then the positioning of the card when it actually verified that it was correct wasn't too far. It's kind of interesting in the sense that this library, which is called Deck, which you can find on GitHub, was fine, but it wasn't designed for watchOS. So I'd actually had to bring it into the project manually and tweak and modify the configurations to be a little more watch specific. So that and a few other stuff we'll get into a little bit later in terms of like refining the other parts of the UI of the app is what I worked on.
It does sound like Kotaro is the one who got everything and his list done.
Well, there was a very short list, to be fair. So I'm going to hand that off to you now. Was it Aaron? Yeah.
So what I think I was working on the algorithm for selecting the next kanji to show in the next card. I got something working. Like there's a method that you can call and say, give me the next one. It's not particularly sophisticated, but it does take into account whether you've seen the character today and whether how many times you've got it wrong versus right. It's like very simple little comparison. And I also made something for the card deck to spit out a set of unique characters to pass to the card deck, because that's what we need for the swipe mechanic. And then I was also working on, what was the other thing? Complications. Yeah, I started working on that. And the core thing of the actual UI is not really working. It sort of works. It's like a placeholder UI that I have, but we do have like a little gauge that shows progress, which I also was like a completely new concept I had to implement of how many characters do they want to see in one day, and what's the goal and the progress to the goal. So that was kind of a whole thing to implement that. Yeah, and I did that without adding any extra core data stuff, since we're already kind of looking at when each character was last viewed. But I might add some more core data stuff later we can talk about.
Awesome. So I was supposed to do the notifications because the main part of the software that I'm supposed to be working on is that, because I'm doing the podcast and the website stuff. But I thought I was going to be able to get all that done, but I actually had a lot of issues, and I guess we'll talk about some of them later. And mostly, though, I think it's the inexperience. So I've been just climbing up the vertical curve of SwiftUI, and I had to also figure out some kind of user interface to actually pick a time. Whether we may not even use that now after I had a talk with you guys yesterday, but the idea was you need to be able to go into settings and choose a notification time, and there's no UI for that. There's no picker for that built in to watchOS. There is for iOS and SwiftUI, but there's nothing for this. So I had to find a third-party one, and I actually used Swift Package Manager for the first time and got it in there and got it working, but I just had a lot of friction with the way SwiftUI wants to do things. But I did refactor a lot of the code around notifications to better compartmentalize it, and created a manager class to start holding all the different pieces you need to deal with. And so right now I kind of broke it since the last time I saw it. So you can schedule notifications, but they're not actually going to work right now because all the handling code is kind of broken. But that's also partially because everything else changed in the app. So the original idea was that notifications themselves would have to carry some data along, like the kanji that's going to display next. But it actually doesn't make any sense with the way that you have daily goals set up, and that. So I think it actually needs to be a little bit simplified. So in a way, so what I'm going to do is update the handling to get stuff from the core data database, which is why we needed that next kanji methods from Aaron. And it was also Thanksgiving and stuff. So sorry, I didn't get it all done. It's almost done.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like my expectation was we'd only for this sprint, realistically speaking, we'd really only get like 1 week's worth of our capacity, and then the next week would barely, which is kind of surprising to me that any work was done at all. But we can get into that.
Oh yeah, I did it right after Thanksgiving. And for me, I usually the first week is usually busy with podcast editing, and then the second week is when I get this. And the second week was Thanksgiving for this last sprint. So
which is kind of fascinating. For me, it's the opposite. Normally, it's like, okay, I'm going to get a chunk of the work done that I'm responsible for this week, and then the second week, it's much more refinements and tweaks and fixes and anything else I can help out with.
I wanted to do that your system there, but it just didn't work out that way, because then I also had some other obligations that fell on my lap right during that first week. So that's the way it goes with these kinds of projects, and we're only doing this part time, and it's rough. It's one of the challenges I'm finding that is really it's useful to go through this kind of process, trying to figure out how to balance my time and focus, because I have so little of it.
If you're ever wondering what your manager, assuming you have a manager at work, is going through, that's exactly what they're going through, is trying to figure out who has the time to do what.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So this gives me a great appreciation for managers everywhere. Good managers
everywhere. That's, we empathize with your struggle.
We made partial progress. I mean, ultimately, after beta testing this thing, we have an app that mostly works. Like, we don't have the notifications working fully yet, but we have the basic functionality prototyping. Yeah, prototype works.
This is probably, I don't know, this is probably what you can call the title of this episode. It's like basically everything almost works. But yeah, that's where we're at in terms of, as a prototype, that's great.
Yeah, as Aaron was saying when we talked off the podcast, there's a point in a project where you're you're not ready for publication. It's not polished enough for the general public, but it basically works. And this is where you need to often rally to get over that last hump, to get that last like 10% or whatever done, so that you can actually put it in the store and people can download and use it, and it not be a completely terrible experience for them.
I mean, in some level, the 10% is the hardest part.
Exactly. That's exactly what Aaron's point was, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's kind of a lie to say it's 10%. It like seems like 10% because you've written like most of the code, but
right. It's more like 65, 70%, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. It's hard, but we gave ourselves a deadline. So we said last time we're going to have to make choices. So that's what's going to happen this week. But we also said last time that we wanted to talk about our merge strategies, because I think some people listening, especially if they're newer to team development, maybe don't quite understand how to use Git or GitHub and PRs and all that kind of stuff. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. So why don't we talk a little bit about how we're doing our merging and branching, so we're not stepping on each other's toes.
Just to understand, Git is just the most popular form of source control out there, and it's probably the de facto at this point. So we use GitHub pretty much in its bare basic form, in terms of we have a main branch, and then we have our own individual branches. So if Aaron's working on a feature, he has his branch, he forks the code, and then he works on his side, and then same with Steve, same with me. And then when we're ready, we do, and at least in GitHub world, what they call a pull request, PR for short. And that way we can submit to the main branch a request for your colleagues, in this case, Steve and Aaron, to review your code, make sure, check the diffs, make sure it's, reasonable, maybe test the PR branch to make sure it doesn't break or, it compiles correctly, it functions based on whatever the PR is trying to say, like this is a PR for fixing the swipe command, this is the PR for notification fixes, et cetera. And then if we don't have it locked to force an approval, which is probably something we probably should consider, we just say, okay, like, ideally it'd be great if it gets approved, right, by, in this case, either Steve or Aaron. But a lot of times we just merge it in anyway.
Yeah, it's difficult to force an approval because we're not working like a regular hours. So it's hard if you have to wait for somebody to have the time to look at it. That's why we didn't quite do that. But just to be clear, like we have our main master branch, whatever you call it, right? And right now we are assuming that just needs to build.
One principle that we should make sure we follow is whatever we put in does not break the build.
Yeah, does not break it. And I mean, I don't know if we're quite in the mentality like this is the branch that's in production, because we're not actually launched yet, and maybe we'll use that mentality later, because at my day job, that's basically how we do it. So the main branch is the code that's actually in the App Store. And then when I go to do a release, I actually make a separate release branch and merge into that and do all the testing. Then, only after that all works do I merge that back into the main branch.
That actually makes a lot of sense, in the sense of, like, traditionally speaking, if you're working for a corporation, you would have a main branch, a dev branch, and release branches. And these release branches are based on versions that you would, there's also feature branches, which is what you or I would be working on, that we would merge back into dev branch. And then once dev branch hits a certain, like, okay, this dev branch is ready to release, we create a release branch for that. And then once the release is out, we merge that back into main.
Yeah, it's a very standard kind of procedure. But, there's only three of us, so sometimes we just merge right in the main.
Well, three of us. So the way I'm looking at it is we stick with this because it's simple. It's simple. Like, the moment you start branching, it just gets overly complicated. So we use the main as the source, source of, like for now. But once we release it, we create like a version branch.
Yeah. So that's another thing we do when we've published something, and then I'll make a tag off of the master branch, and then that tag will be the version that's in the store. Or if it's a web app or something, the continuous integration server does that, and it does all the.
Yeah, I mean, I've been testing Xcode Cloud to be so that once we auto push something into the beta branch, it will activate a build, an archive, to create a test flight build for us. It's not working because I don't know why. But Xcode Cloud is beta, so I'm assuming like watchOS, for example, is because of maybe an exclusive watchOS app. That's why it's getting funky. But I haven't, like, the logs don't say anything.
At least you got an invite. I mean, I applied with the day job email Apple ID, and I heard nothing. Just nothing. So
I find that surprising. You might want to check your junk mail.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I mean, really? I thought they would reply to me, but I'll check because I didn't see anything about accessing it.
I mean, one of the things you can also check is to sign in Xcode. So was it the project navigator? There are like little subtabs, and the farthest subtab in that navigator, there's one for Xcode that says local or cloud. Pick the cloud and then sign in. Yeah.
I saw that on our project, and I was like, "Ooh, cool!" And then it just doesn't quite work yet. But it is nifty. It is the Xcode Cloud is the continuation, or the result of Buddy Build, right? Being purchased years ago. I remember we had Buddy Build at the Philly Coca.
Oh, right. Philly Coca Love.
Coca Love. That was when I first joined Philly Cokeheads. And I remember they were there as a vendor, and I got their T-shirt, and I got to tell you, it is one of the most comfortable T-shirts I own. Is that Buddy Bill T-shirt?
I was very sad when they got bought.
I know, and I didn't get a chance to use their service either because they got bought like right when I was looking at using a continuous integration server. But from what I understand, everybody who talked to me about it said it was great. So I have high hopes for Xcode Cloud.
It's from a setup point of view, it's pretty straightforward. From it getting to work is a different story. So something where it's to be continued.
Yeah, and it might not be working, as you said, because we're doing a watchOS app, which kind of leads into the bulk of, I think, today's discussion, which is the app architecture. How is our app actually designed? Now that we've gotten things kind of working, as we said earlier, mostly working. For those that maybe especially are new to watchOS development, what is actually the structure of an app? So specifically, what is the structure of a SwiftUI focused app doing all the latest stuff in iOS 15, like a high level? And then specifically, what are we doing in our particular app architecture? And not to say that we're doing it the 100% correct way. But I know that Kotaro, you probably have the best understanding and the most experience with SwiftUI apps at the moment. So maybe you can kind of run us through the core concepts.
I mean, at the core, it's mostly, you're mostly dealing with structs. So structs, yeah.
Not classes like you would in UIKit.
Not class. So not object oriented for the most part. You will work with classes, but much more in sort of like normally speaking, you might think of it like use it for data specific interactions and state management kind of thing, and that's great for that. But normally you're working with structs and specifically views, where you would composite a lot of views inside of other views, and it's great in the sense that it's much less code. So like on average, a Swift file would probably only have no more than maybe like 300 lines of code, slightly more if you're doing something super complex, but that also would inform you that maybe you're doing too much and you would need to break that out somehow. Normally, a lot of your logic is, you're trying to keep a lot of the logic out of these views and put them into either classes or other manager, like a manager class of some kind. That makes things a little cleaner from a file size perspective.
Right. So you have a lot of these SwiftUI views, not to be confused with the UIKit views, which are different things.
Right.
And you're by using the SwiftUI, what do we call that language? It's kind of like its own domain specific language, SwiftUI.
What do you mean? Like it's
like, I mean, isn't there like what is it the what do they call the modifiers, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of it's modifiers and whatever you call, what do you call something? What is it called? Like the text is that just a view?
That's just a view. Like everything's a view.
Okay, so everything's just a view. Everything is a view, and then you have modifiers, which are like dot notation on the end of them when you're writing it, and then that modifies the state.
But they stack. So in a weird way, like I feel like I'm almost back into like my old school HTML days, if that makes any sense. The great way to look at it is like a view is always centered inside of the parent view, right? So as long as you can literally centered by default. So you can, if you think of it that sense, it's unique in that sense of where that's when you sort of that's kind of like how you start and then how you sort of manipulate the layout.
And that's different than UIKit views, right? Which
the thing is like the thing that's different in like this. You can normally traditionally you would start UIKit kind of app with a storyboard or a NIV file, or if you really hate that kind of interface, you would just do a straight code. I think SwiftUI doesn't, it's mostly just straight code, but a lot of times I mean, you have a live preview, but that's really just to facilitate you editing your code, and tweaking your modifiers, teaching the parameters to kind of create your special view. And each view is, think of it like a component of a larger view. So you might have a text with rounded corners and color backgrounds and maybe a drop shadow of some kind. Those are just modifiers that you're adding. That's why, versus like in UIKit, you would have to sort of spend a lot of time defining, like maybe you have to go down to the CA layer, and then you would have to like create the radius and maybe create a custom class and that kind of stuff. Like a lot of like basic stuff, a lot of stuff that you would think is basic either in the HTML world or in other platforms, but is a pain in the butt in UIKit. It's now like 1 or 2 lines of code in SwiftUI.
So in UIKit, you would say you're more specifically specifying how things look, how they work. You're saying, I'm going to draw this on the screen. It's going to be this size. It's going to be this shape, this color, stuff. And you're more like declaring what you want in SwiftUI. It's more like a SQL kind of style in that sense.
I think the trap that a lot of UIKit developers coming into SwiftUI get into is like they are so used to managing state inside, say, a UI view controller, and then kind of like breaking that out however you decide your architecture, whether it be view model or some other approach or MVC. But in SwiftUI world, like you are saying, okay, we have certain states that we manage, but you're really focused on in the view section, you're just focused on the layout. And then maybe like the modifications that happen within that layout. So like if a button shows up at a certain time, you have a state for that or something like that. But then that state is managed through other means.
Yeah, right. Would you say it's similar in style to React?
I would say to be honest, I'm not familiar with React or Flutter as deeply. It strikes me as a lot of inspiration taken from React. So if you're coming from React or Flutter, I think you'll have a better time getting adapted to this flow. Whereas if you're coming from UIKit, really good example is like think as a UI developer, right, Steve? If you want to make, let's say, a card with rounded corners and drop shadows, and let's just a simple example, and like a text in the middle of that card, how would you do that in UIKit?
Oh, okay. Well, you have to start with a view. And then you have to create the size, and you have to maybe go down to another layer in order to do the rounded corners. I mean, I guess there's a few different ways of doing it, but you'd have to specify all that stuff.
Right. So on average, how many lines of code? Like, let's say above maybe 10 lines of code, right?
Oh yeah, it would definitely be above 10 lines of code just to set all that up.
Like if I can think about it,
plus the animations. If you're going to also consider the animation stuff,
I'm not even bothering those. Just the drop shadow. So now SwiftUI, you have a text, you have you say, okay, you dot padding, let's say 10. Maybe you say dot frame. Well, maybe you start with dot frame because everything stacks. So dot frame is like maybe like 100. Dot add some padding. Do dot background color is red. Dot corner radius is 10. And dot shadow, I think it's shadow. Drop shadow is like whatever 5. But that right there, that was it.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, it's a little handful of code, and it's compact. It's easy to read. It's easy to understand.
Well, that's debatable. You have less reading, but it's a lot of like trying to interpret the stack of like how they stack together correctly. That's where the real challenge, the real pain points are.
So one of the things I noticed though in the SwiftUI app is it's very different than UIKit and how like everything's set up. So like the entry point for the app is no longer an app delegate, which is new. Is that new in 15 or 14 that they had this app struct? It's pretty new though, because you could still do an app delegate before, right?
Yeah, it's probably like a version back that they introduced that, and even then, I think afterwards they changed it again. Like they changed it several times. So I'm trying to remember if this version, like 15, if anything changed dramatically. I think it did, but I can't speak offhand on that.
So what I think is interesting is the app delegate is a place where at the junk drawer of your app often, and in the SwiftUI using this app struct, I find that it's very compact, at least for what we're doing with it. It still can kind of be a junk drawer, but it doesn't use the traditional methods and the lifecycle methods it would be called in the app delegate. Instead, you have this scene builder. I mean, it's just a big. It's structured very similarly to a SwiftUI view. There's a method, there's a body, right, that has to return a scene, and then you have to, set up a window group, structure in here, and then that's how you set up your windows, and then there's some properties for picking up when things change, like whether it's become the foreground or not, essentially. So I find it a little, when I first looked at it, it's a little confusing. Like, what is a scene builder? What is this? What is a window group? What does a scene mean? What does dot on change mean? What's a scene phase? But once you look up all the stuff in documentation, actually it's pretty cool. It's pretty straightforward to figure out some of this stuff. Like, and I guess we can talk about it later, but for instance, just setting up, how notifications are handled, like what type of notifications, like one line in the scene builder code here. And we still are using this as a place to put persistent objects that we need. So like the non-SwiftUI view stuff, it's still in here as like a private property. But, and I'm also used to doing app delegates on Objective-C, which also requires header files and implementation files and like importing everything. And it's a lot more code than I'm used to seeing. And then after the app structs, that gets you into the app, and then everything else is just SwiftUI views.
For the most part, yeah. And certainly every version of every new version that's come out, they do their best to reduce a lot of code. So even like in this case, some of the stuff that normally you would find as like an extra function or something is thrown into a modifier of some kind.
Yeah, they like the modifiers and the property wrappers. Which can you define a property wrapper? Do you know do you know it well enough to define it? Like what it means to have a property wrapper? Because sometimes I'm not sure what that means. Like, isn't scene builder a property wrapper? Like, because it's anything with it's like these at signs over them, for them. Yeah,
you could think of them like there is a lot of templated code that it is trying to, and usually a lot of it's just like setup code. So like a lot of this is like trying to hide combine behind the scenes, like combine setups behind the scenes.
It reminds me of like annotations in other languages like C#, where you just kind of put this like little annotation at the top of a method or a class, and then that adds functionality in there. Like might add a part of the HTTP pipeline if it's in like ASP.NET, application. You might just add a filter and you just put it there at the top of your class, or you put there at the top of your class that this is, that this implements something related to the pipeline it's in. So it kind of reminds me of that. They look to me, when I look at them, just like these like attributes, but that's not technically what they are though, right? They're, because you don't put more than one of them on something, right? So that's what they kind of look like to me though. So just for people maybe more familiar with like C#. It's an interesting concept. I don't think I've quite got my head wrapped around that.
I think it's tough because like if you've worked with combined and then you use this property wrapper, it's like, whoa, this is much better. This makes more sense.
Yeah, combine feels like, I haven't had to use it, but it seems like an intermediary step between where we were and where they want to go, or where we are arriving at with like async await and the property wrappers.
Yeah, I mean, the use case I can still feel like are still valid, but it's now much more. It's much more hidden in some ways.
So, one thing with the SwiftUI stuff that hit me when I was first working on this is like how do you get state passed around? Like, how do you access things? For instance, how do you gain access to core data, and like where how does that work? So they have a concept called environment in SwiftUI, which is kind of what, like it's globally accessible from like any view. You can kind of say, I want to grab this thing from the environment, like environment variables in a on a terminal or something, is what it seems like to me.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing, and I'm still getting used to it, to be quite frank. But what I've understood is that you set it up at a high level. So in our case, we might have set it up in the abstract. But then we sort of say, okay, we attach it to a view that it's going to start in, right? So initialize it in the top level, and then any child view has access to it if they go, at environment object, or environment object or whatever, right? Like it's just a way. So it used to be you had to pass it down manually, and now and maybe that was just me not understanding it, but basically all you have to do is pass it to the parent, to the top level root view, and then all its child view will inherit it.
So it's interesting because traditional dependency injection, you do it normally you do it through like a constructor, but you can do it other ways. But that's what we would have to do. So in like the Objective-C world, where my legacy code I work in, I'd have to literally manually inject it, just as you said. If I had something higher up the stack, I'd have to initialize there, and then I have to pass it down, and that can get really onerous, especially on SwiftUI, I would imagine, because you have all of these different views sometimes, this stack of them.
One of the things that I tend to do now, like it's kind of funny because like data management becomes easier. It's like, okay, I try to make sure I don't have so many classes related to the core data experience, and core data being one of them. It's like, okay, like that is the, that's where I get all my Kanji data from. So that should be available everywhere, right? Versus like maybe settings, I guess that should be everywhere in a lot of ways, in the way we use it. Thankfully, we don't have a lot of subviews, but I'm trying to think of like a specific example.
Well, we have daily progress provider is an environment object, which is a class you guys wrote, so I don't really know what it does exactly.
It just keeps track of what the goal is, what the daily goal is of like maybe 3 Kanji a day, and then where we are in that progress.
So looking at the code, this brings me up another point about all this environment and state stuff, because I think the state management is the thing that's the hardest to get your head wrapped around when you're coming from UIKit or more traditional environment. So I'm looking at the daily goal progress, and you have it implements it's observable object, which I think is a protocol, right? And then you have variables in this. It's a class too, not a struct. And then in here you have some published. It says as a property wrapper called published around some variables like daily progress, daily goal, viewed total count. So what does that mean? What does observable object and publish? How do they work together? And what do you use them for outside the class? Maybe Aaron could talk about that. Or
also, I'm not sure if I'm exactly using it correctly, but the idea is that the idea is the published properties inside the observable object signify when a view is using those, saying, okay, I'm using this published property. When the outside object is modified, it's like, oh, I need to update this view. And you don't actually have to explicitly tell the view, update the view. You're just saying update the object, and then that updates the view.
So if I'm using this object of the daily goal progress provider somewhere in the app, and I change a value of daily progress, so it starts out at 0. If I set the value to 2.0, whatever, that will then update anywhere else that's using it. So anywhere else that accesses that value will use it. So it's a nice way of doing, like, what I would do. What I used to do that kind of thing was use notifications, not push notifications, local notifications, the other notifications that are in iOS. And you'd have to set that up so you'd subscribe to them in the classes that you wanted to subscribe to them. And yeah, it was a lot of boilerplate to set it up. And then you set the notification, then you'd have to read the contents from it and pull out the user info keys.
So the value there is that let's say you change the value. Like, I'm trying to do something where I'm trying to hide the refresh button until the daily progress is done, and then it shows up, right? So how do I do that? Well, if the daily progress says, okay, you're good, right? Only then will I say, I would set the opacity to be like 1, right? And I can do that by just making sure that I check the value of that daily progress.
Is there like sort of a rough equivalent in UIKit for doing this kind of thing?
I mean, aside from using combine.
Yeah. Well, no, I guess you use combine now. I guess before combine, it was just.
I mean, the thing is, like, you would have to directly do that logic in the view controller or wherever.
Then you have combine, and then now you can do this, which just makes it a lot easier to basically subscribe to changes in an object kind of automatically almost. And the code is very simple. You literally is just the property wrapper around just in front of some variables in our case, because it's a simple class. But
one of the things I do find interesting about SwiftUI, for me at least, is if you're overthinking it, you're probably overthinking it.
Oh my! I've been doing that a lot. I've been overthinking things, and then I realized, wait, it's not that complicated. So SwiftUI in general, though, I would say you talked about views earlier, and one of the things about it is it's both like a blessing and a curse the way these things work with all the different modifiers you can do, because it ends up making these view files look like a mess at first unless you refactor them into different views. And I feel like it's part of their design. I don't know if it's on purpose, but I feel like it might be. So you build something in a SwiftUI view, and then once it gets to be it starts getting an unmanageable size, then you can kind of easily take a chunk of that and put it into its own view. So you just kind of refactor as you go, but it doesn't get in your way when you're actually initially building.
Feels like it lends itself to refactoring. I mean, sometimes you just look at it and it's like, man, this is so ugly. I need to do something. I mean, you're supposed to do that anyway, but like with SwiftUI, it's just like it's very easy to be like, to throw tons of modifiers to see what works. And then once you've got it to work, you're like, oh, yeah, maybe I need to refactor this.
I was trying to do the notification stuff, and the primary way you interact with notifications is you have to go through the user notifications framework, right? And that is, I think, an Objective-C based framework. And so when I have to refactor things, it's, okay, I have a class, and now I have to make like a struct, or I have to make a class that implements this, and then I have to set the properties up, and I have to like do a whole bunch of work in order to just set up all the types for things to operate for this. Whereas if I'm just working in a SwiftUI view, it's kind of like I just copy and paste a big chunk of my code into another view, and I'm done in like seconds. Whereas, more traditional traditional mechanisms where you have to build all these types and they all exist in different files. So it's just like a lot to me. It just seems like a lot more. There's just a lot more work involved in the non SwiftUI way of doing things. Because if you're doing them properly, you need to create a bunch of types or things, a bunch of classes or a bunch of structs, and that means they're all going to be in different files and from the beginning. So it's just like more setup work and more thinking through the architecture. Whereas I feel like this is not exactly apples to apples here because but when I'm just doing a SwiftUI thing, I can just work in the one file and do a lot and mess around with a lot and experiment and try things and add and delete things and comment stuff out and just make a huge mess. But then when I have something working, I can refactor it quite easily. Whereas I feel like the more traditional approach is you just end up doing a lot more ceremonial setup and stuff from the very beginning. Because you can't just put everything in one file. I think that's one of the things I like about SwiftUI. Is that literally you can just dump everything in one giant file and get away with it to a large extent to start with, and just for that experimental, aspect of it.
I mean, everything is you treat the views almost like components.
Notifications is not a SwiftUI kind of concept. So you have to implement a couple different classes, and one of the things we had though SwiftUI specifically is that there's no picker for date and time on watchOS like that I can find. There just isn't one. If you look in the documentation, there is a date picker of some sort, but it's not supported in watchOS. And I looked online, and it looks like other people have made some UI to kind of mimic the picker that's in the Alarms app, because that's the only app on my watch, I think, that has kind of a date picker in it. So I was looking to try to mimic that, and I ended up finding a third-party really simple implementation that I grabbed and got that to work as a UI picker. But I was amazed that how many versions of watchOS have there been, and there's no way of choosing a date. Am I wrong? Like I couldn't.
What amazes me is the fact that you have something called watchOS, and as a development platform, you can't pick a time or a date.
A time, I can't. Unless I'm missing something, I could not find a picker for time or date on this thing. It was really weird.
Yeah, I personally couldn't tell you. Granted, I haven't looked very deeply into it,
but there's and for notifications, so I did get that. I got it set up so you could use that UI that I found, and I had to bring it in as a Swift package manager, which is our first Swift package manager dependency, and it may be our last. I may actually remove that as dependency and like bring in the code directly or do something else. But I wanted to try the Swift package manager stuff, which I haven't used. Have you guys used that much in other projects? I use mostly CocoaPods.
I have, but I don't know about you, Aaron. Once you use it, it's hard to go back, because I mean, it does. It used to be really aggressive with like checking to see if there's a new version, but because it will do that automatically for you. But I haven't had any real issues with the modern setup. It's great because you don't have to have a workspace. It doesn't do anything to your build phase. It doesn't do any custom work to get everything to work correctly. Again, you're not dependent on, this is a first party solution versus relying on CocoaPods, which is fine. I mean, it's served the community well for years. But it's a nice thing to sort of like do if the package supports it. I'm sorry, if the third party package supports it, I mean, that's just the easier path to take. Just in terms, especially for a simple project like this, like it's worth it to me. It feels a lot easier to integrate into your project.
Yeah, I like it a lot actually. Just the one time I use it here. Although the thing that got me confused is I'm used to something like NuGet on the C# side, where there's a file that you can just literally modify and just put in a different dependency in there, or pod file where you can just put in a line of text in the one pod file and then run on the command line pod install, and it'll just download dependencies. Whereas I was looking for that here, because I guess my tendency is to look for the command line level of how to do things, and I couldn't find out like how do I add this file, like where do I change it. It seems like Xcode really wants you just to go through their GUI, and as you pointed out yesterday during Side Project Saturday, Kotaro, it was possibly because the structure of one of the I don't know what do you call it, the package manager info file, whatever it's called. It's more complex than some other types, and maybe that's why it's like slightly more complex. I don't know, but I once I just gave up and said, fine, Xcode, I'll just use your UI. It wasn't too bad. I found it a little weird that in order to directly add a CocoaPod that didn't show up in their list but was on GitHub, I had to copy and paste the URL into what looks like just a search field, because it's like a search field combo field. It's like if you put a URL in, it will look it up at that URL or something, right? It'll look for the info there, or you can just search for keywords and stuff. I find that UI design maybe a little confusing to combine the two, but it works.
Well, it's interesting because like it has a little pseudo search where you can find Apple's specific stuff like the Swift algorithm package and that kind of stuff. Yeah, which is it's kind of like their way of like saying, here are some starter things you can take a look at or put in your own, which is fine.
But that was most of my struggles with the notification stuff, was just getting a user interface that would work, and then the fact that it does this binding, the binding stuff in SwiftUI, which I'm just so not used to in this world, because that's has not been a thing in iOS ever.
One thing we should probably consider going forward, especially as we're hitting this sort of like the end of this particular project, is to sort of do a little more regular checkup in terms of like, if you're coming to a struggle and you want to get some feedback, either we can do a Zoom call or we can do like just bring it up in Slack. Like, I'm really struggling with this. Can I get some help? I know we, as programmers, we tend not to do that, but I think like for me, I know that's a flaw I have that I try to get better on, is just to say, don't bang your head on something for so long and not bring it up with the team and say, hey, I'm not getting it. What am I missing?
Yeah. And one of the struggles I had there that we talked about yesterday was like, if I want to list the notifications that have been scheduled, because essentially doing notification stuff is kind of like interfacing with a separate database. It has its own interface, its own class, its own method calls. And it's like, okay, I have a SwiftUI view, and SwiftUI views work with like the state, and it only changes when like the state changes. But I have to interface with this more traditional class where I have to call a method that's asynchronous to say, give me the pending, thing. So then what do I do? And then one of the issues was the objects you get back from that notifications framework are not something you can just kind of use in a view. I noticed like they're not of the right type. What do they say? They're not identifiable. They don't implement identifiable, apparently. So if I tried to just get, so what I would normally do is and I wanted to try this to avoid having like lots of code when I was just trying to get things to work. I wanted to just get like the notification objects from the system and then loop through them and build like a simple view just to see what's in them. That's what I would do if it was UIKit, and you could just print it out too. And I did that at first, but once I wanted to try to get a view, but you can't do that because you can't just use any kind of type inside the SwiftUI view area. Like, it just doesn't work. I've noticed this several times on here, and it makes sense because what you're looking at is the body method, and it seems like there's certain rules for what can be inside that body method, unless I'm misunderstanding how it works. But if I tried to, for instance, try to loop through, or maybe I just couldn't find the right mechanism. If I tried to loop through the UN notification requests or whatever they're called, like I couldn't do that because they said, it doesn't implement identifiable or something. So then I had to create my own type that does implement that, which is really simple. But then I had to convert to that. So then I created a manager class to basically act as the intermediary, which is a good practice anyway. And I was going to get around to doing that, but I just wanted things to work. So I couldn't do what we were just talking about with SwiftUI, where you just kind of throw everything at the screen and just get it to work. and then refactor. Like I had to stop what I was doing, start building this infrastructure before I fully understood what I was doing, and just so that I could have types that would work in the SwiftUI world. And this could very well just be because I'm still pretty new to this and I'm just doing it wrong. But that took up way more time than I thought. Just doing that, like building all these little integrations.
I am very conscious of the fact that a lot of what we're saying is going to sound newbie-ish in that sense. But I feel the validity of like this is the common struggle, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know how to do this in other frameworks. I know how to do this in other languages. I know how to do this in UIKit. But when I'm doing the SwiftUI, I'm like, how? So like one of the things is like, how do I get the data from the pending notifications into little views, just text, which is what I started with? How do I get it to do that when the view loads? I'm like, because there's no methods like that, like in UIKit, like view, will appear or something. And then there is an on appear.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like there is, but it's one of the things that we talked about at Side Project Saturday was this idea of like, depending on what you're trying to do, you might want to either use .task. Like you can use on appear and it'll be fine, but that's like on appear for every, like if, for example, you're doing a network call, that doesn't get canceled. Whereas if you do it on .task, that will, if you decide to.
But I feel like you should be passing all your data into your view from outside. There's a lot of the things. So if you start to do any like business logic or like implement any other methods like in your view, you're probably like, oh, this data should be coming outside, and the view should just be displaying whatever it is that you're displaying.
I think the way to look at it is, for example, if you create a dependency like bar, let's say Kanji, right? As in our world, and in this particular app's case, like do all your logic outside in the notification class, and then say, okay, I'm sending you this Kanji as a parameter for this view. You just do a var, just do a var Kanji, and then have the setup done in. But once that's there, right, it's going to be there. So then now you're just saying, okay, Kanji, here's the Kanji text, here's the meeting, and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We were talking about earlier how the differences in how you do these things between like SwiftUI and more traditional stuff, and how you might be used to doing things in a view controller, right? Just doing kind of all there, and that's kind of the mentality I had when I started working on it. And again, it was not because I thought that was the right way of doing it. I was just trying to figure out how I wanted everything to work. I wanted to experiment, try to like, how do I get this to look right in this view? How do I get into? And so I was trying to do things a sloppy way on purpose to start with, but it seems like SwiftUI really doesn't work that well when you try to do things like the wrong, quote unquote, wrong way. So you're absolutely right. I should be injecting this into the view somehow by whatever mechanism is maybe appropriate for this. Instead of trying to call it when the view loads. But that's such a common thing to do with UIKit when the view controller loads, which is so tightly coupled with the views loading that they're almost synonymous most of the time, right? Like when you have a view controller. So normally what I would do is like, I have a lot of code in the legacy app. Like when you have the view controller would load, that's when it would go and get the data it needs, like a network call or something. And then it would bring it back and then update the UI. But in this case, that's not really working too well because there just isn't, like, I got to the point where, okay, I got it working on appear, but then I cleared the reminders, right? I wanted to delete them. I want a button just to delete them all to get rid of them. And that call doesn't have any kind of callback mechanism or anything. It's just an asynchronous method that returns void, I think. So, okay. So now how do I refresh the UI? How do I make the UI change, like reload this stuff again and run on appear again? And I couldn't get it to work. And of course, that's not really the right way of doing it. So it's like I got kind of down a rabbit hole of doing things the wrong way because I was trying to save time to like figure things out before I refactored. And so I got this whole like mess. I'm like, oh my God, I'm just making more work for myself because I'm doing it wrong.
That is sort of the funny programmer's dilemma in some ways. Yeah. And I know.
So I don't know, maybe you can tell me how I'm supposed to do this. Maybe like after this podcast. because I'm still not 100% sure how to inject this in there.
I've grown to believe it's in many ways it's sort of like the blind leading the blind in a lot of ways of this project, but in a sense of like going through our own SwiftUI journey, that's what you're experiencing in that sense.
Exactly. And so it's going to show you, it doesn't matter how many years of development experience you have. I mean, it can sometimes get in your way because you're used to doing things one way. And even when you understand, basically what's going on, there could just be all these details you just don't quite understand. This feels a lot like when I was first learning UIKit. It was just a very foreign experience. It's not quite that level because, it's still like a watchOS app and it's still somewhat similar to an iOS app. It's just, there's a whole bunch of concepts in SwiftUI that you have to understand, at least at a superficial level, to do anything productive beyond like the tutorial level stuff. You have the environment, you have property wrappers, and you have views, and you have modifiers, and then you have a little bit of the special modifiers for like things that come up here.
But those are different terminologies. Like you can always say the same in terms of like IB outlets and IB actions that can.
No, exactly my point. It's just that when you're coming from one to the other, you have to do this like translation, and the translation doesn't always work one-to-one.
Yeah, I feel like SwiftUI is more like when you have a view, it's more like a web page. Like this is a page that it's like it shouldn't do anything. This is just this is what I should display, and it doesn't know anything. Not usually. Sometimes you can like run some scripts or some simple scripts on the page, but you should.
I get a little scared. Excuse me. I get a little scared that you can do so much functionally, like logic. Like before, you couldn't do if-else statements. You could do ifs, but you couldn't do else statements. Now you can do switch. There's certain areas where you can do the logic. But in the actual view itself, you couldn't do it.
Yeah, but the logic should just be like, what should be displayed? It should just be like, this will change the structure of the view and display different stuff, different components, but not actually deal with any kind of data, really.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm trying to avoid doing too much stuff in the actual view, but it feels like it's turning into PHP a little bit with all the structures you can put. You can really shoot yourself in the foot, But that's kind of I think it's also a strength because because it lets you hack around before you do it properly. But as I said, when you're integrating other components that are not very SwiftUI like, that doesn't quite work.
It really does fit with my mental model of programming, which is much more of like you're sketching this idea out and you don't quite know what you're doing and you're just playing around, you're trying to figure it out, and then this is why I think tests, unit tests and UI tests just drive me nuts, because like my mental model is like, I want to play, I want to explore this layout, I want to get just this, fine tune and refine this UI and do the logic and do some cool things while I'm doing it, add some drop shadows, get some blend modes, Z layer that thing up, add some animations. Like you can have a lot of fun in SwiftUI. And I think with UIKit, like there's a lot more formality in terms of like, okay, get the layouts, put your auto constraints here, set up some logic in the IB actions and IB outlets, and then like write the code to get that to say, okay, if this, like where's the data coming from, and then how is it? There's a lot more. There's a lot more like setup, like you said. But in any case, I think we're getting a little too far into this discussion. I think there's the thing we wanted to talk a little bit about was core data.
Oh no, just I guess the main thing is like how you handle migrations, and I haven't really. I know it's like a thing, but I'm kind of avoiding changing the data model, because I know if you change the data model, it just crashes unless you delete everything and delete all your stored data. If you don't handle.
Sorry, so what's a core data migration for those listening?
As I understand it, that you have to have some check. If you've changed the data, the actual data model, like if you've added some new entity or property to your entities, like a major change to your data model, then you have to have some check when you initialize your persistent store, or it just crashes.
Yeah, so you can create versions and then you can create migrations to those versions, which Apple does have decent support for. We shouldn't have to think about this until after release.
I want to make all the changes that I'm going to do before we release.
I think it's okay to do if you're thinking about them, and you think we're gonna want them for the near future, then go ahead and add them, because our database is really bare bone. Like it's super vanilla in a lot of
No, it's more the thing of once a user starts storing their stats, if I want to make any changes, then I do have to handle that so they don't have to lose all of their stuff. So I want to do it properly. I know it's a thing, and I know how like other things handle it, but I just haven't actually looked into the details of implementing it.
I want to add some major feature creep. Should integrate core data CloudKit sync, then they never lose their data. But that's actually a bad idea for a variety of reasons. So okay, well then that was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so well, as usual, Aaron is like the most on the ball of all three of us. Generally, he's like, yeah, I got all my stuff done, and now I'm trying to do something extra.
Yeah, so this is where we get into the topic of feature creep.
So we're not even done with the app yet, but we're already talking about some other things, and some of these are not necessarily feature creep though. They're kind of expected things in a watchOS app, like complications. So Aaron, you were doing some complications a little tiny bit. I think you briefly mentioned it earlier. Is there anything like I looked at complication, I thought it was like, wow, that looks like overly complicated. But so how hard or easy is it to actually implement basic complications in watchOS?
So the hardest thing I feel like is that you have so many like UI designs for all the different ways, the different types of watch faces and different sizes. I don't know, there's like 20, or it feels like, I don't know, maybe it's not quite that much, but it feels like there's at least like, there's somewhere between like 15 and 20 or different ones that you don't have to implement them all, but if you want your complication to be able to display correctly in all the different corners and sizes and shapes, then you have to design a different UI, unless you're using one of the templates. There's quite a few templates that are available. But the thing that I did was I just used like a template gauge view and it's not even really, it's definitely not what we want to use for the app, but it does display some data about the daily goals. And the interesting thing about with complications, as I understand it, it's like you just handed a timeline of updates, and right now I'm just handing it like, here's the data until I tell you it's changed. So just display this, but you could hand it like even like updates every second. So you could do like a clock that ticks every second. You could say like, oh, this is what it's going to look like for the next hour or the rest of the day or something. Or you can just hand it one thing and say, I'm going to hand you some update later. And then you invalidate it and say, okay, here's the new data. Or you can just project it out into the future and say, this is what it's going to look like until your data changes, and you invalidate all those things.
So which complication sizes, I guess, is that the terminology? Like which ones did we have to implement?
I think you really only need to implement. Yeah, I just implemented the circular size.
Circle one. Like it's weird because I think the gauge one works pretty well, but there's like a utilitarian one and for me, I'm trying to like do the screenshots or the placeholder images for that, so that when you select it, for example, you have, or there's no data at the moment, it has a sort of like a placeholder image. That's a different challenge, because at the moment I don't see any sketch files or anything that will allow you to like mimic the UI, even as something as basic as a gauge. So I have to figure out something there.
So one thing I noticed, do you know how complications like are set up? Because there's a complications controller that I think was included with a template, but I don't know how it gets hooked into the app. Where, for instance, when I do a notification, I have to in the app Struct, I have to literally hook up like this class is the thing that answers, you know, that renders the notification that comes in. Like here's the class to handle this thing. But for complications, I don't know how complicated. Where's complication controller get instantiated?
I think it's like in the info P list. There's a thing for which ones.
Yeah, so he did one. There seems to be like a make template, right? As an extension, and then there you can identify the family. In our case, a graphics circular complication, and that's where he creates his complication view, his Swift view, which I think, yeah, that's basically how he does it.
Yeah, I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff that just kind of seems like it happens in a SwiftUI, like it just happens in a SwiftUI app. I'm like, by convention or something, and I don't know what is.
Basically, with complications is you have a series of timeline entries, and you can have like a view that goes with each, like a full SwiftUI view if you want, that goes with that entry. So the main thing is that, what time is it going to display it, and then whatever the view is, and you can like use the templates that are provided, or the template could just be a template, and it's just any SwiftUI view that you make. Obviously, it has to make sense for the tiny little complication size.
Yeah. So now we just have the small circular one. We're probably not going to do beyond that for this release.
Not beyond that. Yeah, that would be feature creep.
And so we're still working on that one. Some kind of gauge. You think we're going to keep going with that?
Yeah, I would like at least customize it with our icon or something. So because right now it's too generic that you can't even really tell what it's for.
But I like it. It tells you what your goal is and how far along you are on your daily goal.
Yeah, I know. But if you have other similar gauges and things, so that's the main thing. That's my main problem with it.
Yeah, I mean, probably what I would do is much more branding specific. So maybe make it red or something like that, just to be a little more like, oh, you're done. And then maybe like if you've completed your daily goal, maybe have the icon that way, like you're good or something like that.
At least they provide this. Yeah, at least they provide this view now, so you don't have to do it all yourself. You also, Kotaro, you also started adding other features that are like, you added some kind of haptics, didn't you? Like,
yeah, I had so like if you swipe right or swipe left, it will give you like a failure haptic or a success haptic, and that also includes like sound effects. So if you have your sound on, it'll be like ding da-ding, right? So that was pretty cool, and it was a very like I think 1 line of code, 2 lines of code max. So that was like an easy win. The other thing that I snuck in was I think I have a PR for that. Speech to text on long press. So you long press a kanji character card, and it will pronounce the kanji character based on text to speech. So it could basically do text to speech for Japanese kanji, which I thought was actually pretty cool. And configuration only took like 6 lines of code that you can find anywhere online. Yeah, it was pretty straightforward. So I'm going to keep it in. Might change where you make the call, but yeah, I'm going to keep.
So these would be feature creep in some other framework, but they're so easy to add to our app here that it literally is just, it took you no time.
Particularly, like if you're a project manager, this is the kind of thing that probably would drive you crazy, because it's just like, what, you guys just focus on the thing, just on the thing that we need to get done. So I think that for considering that it's a side project, I'm not like, I don't think that's a big deal.
Yeah. And, because it didn't take very much investment of time anyway to do, and it's a cool thing to add to it.
That's a nice touch.
Why not?
Yeah.
But you got to be careful with this kind of thing normally, because feature creep is real, and it can be devastating.
Getting to a potential example of that was complication that was not on our list.
No, but I did think that we needed to at least have the app icon complication. So we need something. We need the very bare minimum for that, because it's you can't really have a watchOS app that you can't add as a basic complication, I feel like, for this, just to launch it at least.
Then the other thing that was my reasoning, because I actually I remember saying, oh, we need to have it.
Yeah.
like a moron. And it's like, how hard could that be?
I know, right? There's so many little pieces.
Then the other one was, I think, Aaron, you brought this up, Siri intent, or?
Yeah, just because of of like things like you're talking about your date picker UI, and probably why it's not there is because they expect you to do that kind of thing with Siri and on the watch.
So how would that work exactly? Okay, so you're saying so this is SiriKit, and then creating a Siri intent.
Yeah, I haven't looked into it too much, but other than we should have it.
So you could say something like, can I get my daily kanji test, right? And then it would bring up like the 3 options, same as the notifications, but it would bring up the 3 options of like, brings up the kanji and says, I know it, don't know it, dismiss or whatever.
Yeah, even so much as like whenever there's an option, even when the notifications do come up, that you could like dismiss it with the correct or incorrect or whatever. Like any actions that you want to do, you should be able to do it with Siri without any of like the swipe left, swipe right, bring it up, interact with it. You should be able to do it. But I don't know. It's like not that you have to, just it would be nice. Yeah.
Right. Well, it makes sense though, because I interact with my watch a lot with just the speaking to Siri to have it do things.
So I think we have like an enhancement ticket for that.
So that's how you organize this kind of thing. So that we know that we're probably not going to get to this, or if we do get this, it's going to be a last minute thing. So it's an enhancement.
Siri intent. Yeah. So we have an enhancement tag in the GitHub repo.
And I feel like I sort of got like part of the way there in terms of getting it to work with the way you launch the app from the complication is like this kind of the same way you would do it with Siri. Of like you have to have like a thing in the info P list of that this is let me find my thing that I added. It's like a user activity activity type, and then it's just like a URL, like a backwards URL with, and then that passes that gets passed to what is it called?
It's okay. There's a specific method though.
All right, I just created an issue, and I'm going to add an enhancement tag to that on GitHub. I'm going to assign this to you, Aaron, since you're going to be the person to spearhead this feature creep.
Oh yeah, it's this on continue user activity thing, and then it passes that.
And that's the funny part about this is much more like, because it's a side project, there's a lot of things that we want to explore. And I think if you got that itch, you might as well scratch it. Siri intent has actually been an itch that I've been wanting to scratch for a while. So,
but the other half that I don't know how to. So I know how to like respond to the user intent because I did that. But then what to do with the intent is we need to have like deep links to the different screens, and I actually don't know how to do that.
Deep link, that's something that I have experience with, so I can explore that for you.
Yeah. So we need that. So if we have like deep links defined to all the different areas we want to go to, then I don't think it will be too hard. But of course, the famous last words.
I know it's been like that the whole project. Oh, this doesn't look like it's gonna be that hard.
So I can see project managers listening to this, assuming they're listening. It's like, oh, what are these people doing? Why are you doing this? This is again.
Like, look, at least we acknowledge up front.
We're acknowledging up front
by calling this the feature creep section of this podcast. We know.
Yeah,
we know.
We are fully conscious of the bad decisions we are making.
Yeah, we're. That's true. That should be our tagline.
Oh, there's another candidate for the title.
Yeah. So I guess we should probably move to wrapping things up because I think it's gone pretty long today. But it was a good app architecture discussion. So for the next, basically, we're getting down to the wire here for the next this next cycle.
Right. We have approximately 2 sprints left, right? Or is that 1, 2? Yeah.
Essentially, yeah. To release, so which means that this next one I have to really finish getting notifications working in some semblance of a usable way. And then we have to move on from there to polishing things up and then starting with doing the App Store stuff. So the App Store stuff, you already kind of started a little bit of that. We got Test Flight working, right, yesterday?
Basically, yeah.
So we have test flight working, which is good. I thought it was going to be a lot harder to get it through like app review, but it seems like it was just an automated thing for public test flight.
I might have already done a submit for test flight. And they, oh no, that's not true. Yeah, they just automatically approved it for some reason.
I don't know. I've done beta test flight stuff, and it's never.
Yeah, it usually takes a day.
Yeah, usually someone looks at it. But okay, that's good. But then we also need to figure out the App Store metadata. So some of that's pretty straightforward, like screenshots, or that's not a big deal. But we also need to come up with a privacy policy. So we're gonna need to find something that's a decent policy. We don't have any data. So
what I'm gonna do is just use mine as the template. I have one for like iMessage something. It's basic, and maybe like, oh, actually I do have one for my app, so I can just take that, repurpose it for this case, and just we'll put it on a GitHub page somewhere and point to that. And I think that can be done. That like I think this sprint should be focused on finishing the app in a pretty much like release candidate-ish kind of phase. Like I think we should have it fully functional with like some fine-tuning for like one more week. So what would that be? That would be the 12th. We should have it mostly done. I'd say like we want to get to like 90%. And then that gives us the last week to finish up. You know what? Side Project Saturday will be on the 18th. So I say we target that date as our submit date. And then release date can be like pre-Christmas or even on the Tuesday. So like 20.
So that's good. And we also have to figure out the App Store transfer because re-upload it, I guess.
Yeah, we're just gonna make sure that Aaron has all his right. All we just do is point to Aaron's account, basically.
Yeah, he just needs a different SKU, or he needs a different and we have to pick the final name for the app and that kind of thing. But we'll set it up on Aaron's side for the submission, I guess. It's going to be a little bit awkward because doing this way, but we'll get it worked out because one of the goals is to make sure it's in Aaron's account so he gets all the glory. No, I think it's going to work. It's going to be an interesting. It's going to be interesting to work through that and to some degree because it's not an uncommon thing in my world anyway that someone's working on it sometimes on their personal Apple ID, in Xcode, and then I have to get it into like the day job's account. That's happened before where people were doing it on one account, and then I have to just take the build and put it into the new account.
I mean, the one thing that we probably should keep within ourselves, whether it be notations, is like when we're doing upgrades or testing post this launch, we have to make sure that, say, my account's still working. So that so for example, in your case, when we do like a release branch, we're going to switch all the configurations to your account, and then
that's actually that might be a good way of doing it, is setting up a release branch which is different, has all the settings for Aaron in it, and then once that's set up, then we can merge into that. And yeah, and we'll figure it out. It's not too big of a deal because essentially all we're doing is taking the code and uploading it with a different SKU over on your side. And
so my responsibility for this next sprint is to get the whole UI, get the complications working, get the whole UI in solid place for a release, meaning like the UI is prettied up, the functionality is working, all the data is correct, that kind of stuff. And Aaron, I think you have what was it?
The core data migration.
Yeah, I need to see about migrations and doing some updates to core data. And then maybe Siri stuff. I don't know. And complications. I don't know if I'm gonna get to that.
Right. The complication functionality, like I think for me, I'm gonna just try to make sure I get the placeholders working correctly. They might not all be there for any reason, but we're not going to use all of them for sure, but it's just there for the future's sake. So that would be my responsibility. And then getting the UI in decent state. So adding the attributions, the layout, and maybe remove anything that we don't need.
Yeah, there's also the thing of the deep links thing if you want to do the proper way of
Oh yeah, deep links. I should add that as a
tapping on the complication, because it's not the way it's set up now is not working correctly without deep links. And you can't just have it if you just don't pass anything to it, it'll just automatically just launch the app to whatever the default screen is. But it'd be good to be able to direct it where we want it to go.
Whether it'll use the UI we have in there or not, I don't know. But we'll have to get notifications working finally, and obviously I still have the podcast to do and any website stuff. So I'm busy, and it's also the holiday season. So let's see. This is very ambitious. Some of try to get this done in time, but we're going to give it a shot. But I think it's good. I think we're all wrapped up. Are there any last words for the audience?
Oh, thank you for listening to us this long.
Yeah.
We appreciate you. I hope you stick out for the rest of this season and maybe future seasons. Anything else?
I think that's it. I think I'll see you guys later then.
Basically, everything almost works.